My grandmother had a recipe box. It was one of those old metal ones with a latch that didn't quite close all the way anymore, painted red once upon a time, though most of the paint had worn off to a dull rust pink. She kept it on the counter next to the stove, and when I was little, I used to climb up on the step stool and flip through the index cards inside while she cooked. Her handwriting on those cards was small and slanted, and she always wrote in pencil because she said recipes were living things. They changed. They got better, and ink didn't allow for that. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, and I found out by missing a call from my uncle while I was in a deposition. I'm a paralegal. I've been one for 6 years, working for a small firm that handles mostly civil litigation, contracts, property disputes, the occasional employment case. I say this because it matters later. Not because I'm trying to make myself sound impressive, but because the work I do every day is fundamentally about documentation, about knowing what a paper trail looks like, about understanding that people reveal themselves in what they sign and what they don't. My grandmother, Gran, everyone called her, had lived alone in her house in Tucson since my grandfather died in 2019. She was 81, sharp until the last year or so, and she had made it very clear to everyone in the family that she did not want to move, not to assisted living, not to anyone's spare bedroom. She wanted to die in the house where she had raised her children, and she did. I flew in from Portland the night they found her. My cousin, her grandson, her oldest daughter's boy, had been the one to check on her when she didn't answer the phone. He's the one who called the hospice nurse, called the funeral home, called my mother. He did all of it calmly and efficiently, and when I landed at Tucson International at 11:30 at night, he was the one waiting for me at arrivals. His name is Derek, and he is 3 years older than me, and for most of my adult life, I have thought of him the way you think of a piece of furniture you've had so long you stop seeing it. He was just there. Family. Present at holidays, present at funerals, present in the background of every significant moment in my life without ever quite being part of them. That should have told me something. My grandmother's estate wasn't complicated on paper. The house in Tucson, a savings account, a small investment account she'd barely touched in 15 years, some jewelry, the furniture. She had a will drawn up properly in 2021, and she had a financial power of attorney, which named Derek as her agent. She had set it up because he lived closest to her, 40 minutes away in Scottsdale, and because she trusted him. He was the one who drove her to doctor's appointments, the one who fixed things around the house when they broke, the one who called her every Sunday. I did not know when I landed in Tucson that the power of attorney was still active. I did not know a lot of things. The first 2 days were what those days always are. Phone calls and paperwork and the particular exhaustion of grief that isn't just sadness but logistics. The funeral home needed decisions, the church needed a date, distant relatives needed to know. My mother flew in from Albuquerque. My aunt, Derek's mother, came up from Phoenix. We all moved through Graham's house together in that careful way people do when they're trying not to disturb anything, trying to be useful, trying not to cry in front of each other. Derek was everywhere, those first 2 days. Helpful in the way that looks like love, calling vendors, confirming arrangements, asking me where Gran kept certain documents. And the questions were so reasonable in the moment. Was the deed to the house in the filing cabinet or the safe? Did I know the name of her bank? Had she mentioned updating the beneficiary designations on the investment account? I answered him. Of course I answered him. He was family, and we were grieving, and the questions made sense. On the 3rd day, he asked me if I had access to Gran's online banking. I said I didn't. He said that was fine, he'd handle it. He was the POA. He said there were probably some final bills to take care of, utilities, maybe a credit card, and he'd sort it out before the estate formally opened. Practical? Responsible? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in Gran's guest room looking at the ceiling fan and trying to remember exactly what she'd said to me the last time I'd visited, 8 months earlier. She had been more tired than usual, but still herself. Funny, dry, full of opinions about everything. She had showed me a new rose she'd planted along the back fence. She had made me apple cake from one of those index cards and insisted I eat 2 pieces. She had also said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, that she was glad the house would stay in the family. She had looked at me when she said it, not at my mother, who was also there. At me. I had not thought much about it at the time. Lying in that guest room, I thought about it a lot. The next morning, I asked Derek casually whether he'd had a chance to talk to Gran's attorney. I knew she had one. The same man who'd drawn up her will. Derek said he hadn't called yet, but he was planning to. I said I could reach out if that would help. He said no, he'd take care of it. Something shifted in me then. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revelation. It was just a small, quiet thing. The way a familiar room looks different when you come back to it after a long time and realize the furniture has been moved slightly. Not enough to say something is wrong, but enough that you know something is different. I texted the attorney myself that afternoon while Derek was out getting food for everyone. I had his name from a document I'd seen in Gran's filing cabinet. I introduced myself, explained who I was, and asked if he had a few minutes to speak with me about the estate. He called me back within the hour. The conversation was short, but it told me everything I needed. The will, he said, was clear. The bulk of the estate, the house and the investment account, was to be split equally between my mother and my aunt. The savings account, however, had a beneficiary designation. It was not governed by the will. He paused. I asked who the beneficiary was. He told me it was Derek. I sat with that for a moment. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even necessarily wrong. Gran had made a choice. Maybe she'd wanted to reward him for the years of Sunday calls and doctor's appointments and fixing things when they broke. But then the attorney said something else. He said he had received a call that morning, before my call, from Derek, and Derek had asked him whether the financial power of attorney could be used to change the beneficiary designation on a life insurance policy that Gran had. A policy he, the attorney, had not been aware Gran held. He had told Derek no. A PO does not survive the principal's death. As of the moment Gran passed away, the document had no authority over anything. Derek had apparently been surprised by this. I thanked the attorney. I hung up. I sat in Gran's kitchen looking at the recipe box on the counter, and I thought about how carefully Derek had asked me every question. How reasonable all of it had sounded. How much he had managed to learn in 3 days without ever asking anything that seemed suspicious. And I thought about the savings account. The one with the beneficiary designation he already had. The one the POA no longer controlled because she was gone. I called a friend of mine who works in probate. I explained the situation in the flat, factual way I've learned to explain things at work. No emotion, just sequence of events. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then said, quietly, "Has he touched the savings account yet?" I said I didn't know. She said I needed to find out. That night, I did not confront Derek. I smiled at dinner. I talked about Gran's potato soup recipe and how none of us had ever been able to get it right. I helped my mother wash dishes afterward, and when everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I pulled up everything I could find about Gran's finances that was accessible to me as co-executor of the estate, a role I had not known I held until the attorney mentioned it that afternoon. I found what I was looking for by midnight. The savings account had been accessed the day before the funeral. The balance had been moved, not withdrawn in cash, but transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The transfer had been authorized using the online banking credentials, not a POA document. Whoever had done it had logged in, had known the username and password. Derek had asked me if I had access to Gran's online banking. What I hadn't asked was whether he did. The funeral was on Friday. It was a clear October morning, the way October in Tucson sometimes is. That particular flat light that makes everything look a little bit like a photograph of itself. Gran's church friends were there and people I hadn't seen in years, and my aunt cried in that exhausted way that doesn't look like crying until you've been around enough grief to recognize it. Derek was composed throughout. He stood at the front and said something kind about Gran that was also entirely general, the kind of eulogy that could have been for anyone. He shook hands. He received condolences. He was, as he had been all week, impeccably present. After the service, I pulled my mother aside and told her what I had found. My mother is not a person who panics. She is a retired school teacher from Albuquerque who once calmly finished a parent-teacher conference while the fire alarm was going off because she wanted to finish her point. She listened to me with her hands folded in her lap, and when I was done, she said, "What do you need me to do?" I said I needed her to act normal for the rest of the day. She said, "I can do that." Monday morning, I drove to the bank. I had documentation. I had the letter's testamentary from the probate court identifying me as co-executor. I had a printed copy of the will. I had the account number and the transaction records I had pulled online. I sat down with the branch manager, and I explained the situation in the same flat, factual way I'd explained it to my friend. No accusation, just sequence of events. Transfer date, account number the funds went to. The fact that Gran had died 2 days before the transfer occurred, the branch manager excused herself to make some calls. She was gone for 22 minutes. I sat in the chair across from her empty desk and looked at a framed poster on the wall about financial goals, and I thought about Gran's recipe box and the way she'd written everything in pencil so she could change it. When the branch manager came back, she sat down and she looked at me for a moment and then she said, "We're going to need to flag this account." I said, "I know." She said there would be a process, a review, potentially a referral to their fraud team, depending on what they found. I said I understood, and I left my contact information. On the drive back to Gran's house, Derek called me. He said he'd been thinking about the estate and wondered if we could talk through some of the logistics. He sounded the same as he always sounded, measured, helpful, like someone you would trust. I said sure, I was happy to talk through whatever he needed. He said he thought there might be some flexibility in how the investment account was handled, that maybe rather than going through the formal probate process, the family could agree to a different arrangement. Simpler, less expensive. I let him talk. He had clearly thought about this. He had a version of events in which everyone was reasonable and no one called a lawyer, and the family just agreed, quietly, on a distribution that somehow worked out well for him. When he finished, I said, "I've already opened the estate with the court." Silence. I said, "I filed the petition on Friday afternoon, after the funeral." More silence. I said, "I also spoke with the bank." He said, "What do you mean you spoke with the bank?" I said, "About the transfer, the one that went through before the funeral." The silence this time was different. It wasn't the silence of someone choosing words. It was the silence of someone realizing they had walked into a room they couldn't back out of. He said it was just to cover immediate expenses. He said Gran would have wanted. I stopped listening somewhere around there, not because I stopped caring, but because it no longer mattered what he said. It mattered what he had signed, what he had clicked, what account number he had used, what the bank's fraud team was going to find when they looked. I said, "Derek, you should probably talk to an attorney." He said he didn't need an attorney. This was a family matter. I said, "It's not anymore." I drove back to Gran's house. I walked into the kitchen. My mother was at the table with 2 cups of coffee, and she looked up at me and I sat down across from her and we didn't say anything for a while. The investigation took about 6 weeks. I won't walk through all of it because most of it was procedural and dry and not the kind of thing that makes a good story. Emails, document requests, a meeting with the bank's legal team, a conversation with a detective from the financial crimes unit who had the specific kind of exhausted patience of someone who has seen this exact situation many times before. He told me that estate fraud within families was far more common than people expected. He said he was sorry for my loss. What they found was what I had suspected. Derek had accessed the account using credentials Gran had given him, legitimately, years ago, so he could help her pay bills. He had used them 2 days after she died, after the PO was void and before the estate was formally opened. He had transferred the funds to an account he controlled. He had assumed no one would look closely, or quickly enough, or know enough to know what to look for. He had assumed wrong. The money was recovered. Not immediately, not without some procedural wrangling, but eventually, the estate closed about 4 months later than it should have. There were legal costs I hadn't anticipated. My aunt did not speak to my mother for most of that winter, though by spring, something had thawed, the way things do in families even when they probably shouldn't. Derek did not go to prison. There was a negotiated resolution. I won't go into the details because they're genuinely not mine to share. There were consequences. I'll leave it at that. The house in Tucson sold in February. The market was what it was, and we got a fair price, and my mother used her portion to fix the roof on her own house in Albuquerque, which had needed fixing for 2 years. She called me when the check cleared, and she sounded lighter than she had in months. I kept the recipe box. I asked my aunt if she wanted it, and she said no, and I asked my mother, and she said I should have it. So I packed it carefully in my carry-on the flight back to Portland, and it's sitting on my kitchen counter now, next to my own stove, in almost the same spot it sat in Gran's kitchen. I've cooked from some of the cards. The apple cake, which turned out to be easier than I expected, a pot roast recipe that takes all day and is completely worth it, a lemon icebox pie that I've already made 3 times. The thing I keep coming back to, not the fraud, not the investigation, not the procedural slog of the estate, is that conversation in Gran's kitchen 8 months before she died. When she said she was glad the house would stay in the family and she looked at me, I think she knew something was off. Not specifically, I don't think she knew what Derek was planning, if he was planning anything yet, but I think she had started to notice the shape of his questions, the way he asked about finances, the way he steered conversations. I think she was the kind of woman who had been paying attention her whole life and didn't stop just because she was 81. I think she looked at me because she trusted me to pay attention too. I don't know if I did right by her. I know I did what I could with what I knew. I know the estate closed the way it should have and the money went where she intended it to go. I know I have her recipe box and her handwriting in pencil on every card, and the knowledge that recipes are living things. They change, they get better, and ink doesn't allow for that. I think about that sometimes. About what allows for change and what doesn't. About how the things people sign and the things they click and the things they move quietly in the middle of the night are the things that stay. The ink, you might say. And I think about my grandmother, who knew the difference between what was permanent and what could be revised, and who left me her recipe box, and who looked at me when she said she was glad the house would stay in the family. I think she knew I would figure it out. I hope I did. If you've been through something like this, if you've sat at a table after a loss and felt something shift without being able to name it yet, I want you to know that feeling is worth listening to. Document everything. Ask questions even when it feels uncomfortable. And if something doesn't add up, find someone who can help you understand why. The people who love us leave us more than property. They leave us the record of who they were, and we owe it to them to protect it. I've thought a lot about what made Derek think he could get away with it. Not in an angry way, not anymore. More in the way you think about a decision someone made that was so obviously wrong, so obviously traceable, that you start to wonder what they told themselves, what version of the story they were running in their head where it all made sense. I think the answer is that he assumed no one was paying attention. And for a long time, that assumption had probably been correct. He was the responsible one, the one who showed up, the one who drove Gran to her appointments and fixed the gutters and called on Sundays. That kind of consistency builds a kind of credibility that's hard to question without feeling ungrateful. He had earned trust, and then he had used it as cover. Slowly, quietly, over years, until the moment came when he thought he could use it all the way. What he didn't account for was that Gran had been paying attention too. She looked at me in her kitchen 8 months before she died and said she was glad the house would stay in the family. She didn't say why she looked at me. She didn't explain. But I've come to believe that she knew, in the particular way that people who have spent a lifetime watching others know things, not with proof, not with certainty, but with that quiet, settled sense of reading a room correctly. She had watched Derek's questions shift. She had felt the shape of his interests change. And she had looked at me because she trusted that I would feel it too, when the time came. That's the thing about paying attention. It compounds. Every year you spend actually watching the people around you, not just hearing what they say, but noticing what they do, what they ask. When they ask it, you build something, a kind of literacy. It doesn't make you suspicious of everyone, it just makes you accurate. Derek made a choice rooted in the belief that no one would look closely. That grief makes people slow and trusting and focused on other things. He wasn't entirely wrong about that. Grief does all of those things. But it also clarifies something. It strips away the noise and leaves you with what actually matters, and sometimes what actually matters is a question that keeps you awake at midnight until you find the answer. The money came back. The estate closed the way Gran intended. The house was sold and the proceeds went where they were supposed to go. But I don't think the most important thing that happened was the legal outcome. I think the most important thing was smaller than that. It was sitting at Gran's kitchen table at midnight with my laptop, tired and sad and not entirely sure what I was looking for, and deciding to look anyway. Not because I was certain, not because I had proof. Just because something didn't add up, and I had learned in 6 years of working in civil litigation that things that don't add up usually have a reason. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the decision, made quietly and repeatedly, to do the right thing even when no one would know if you didn't. Derek chose differently. He chose convenience over honesty and appetite over decency. And he did it while accepting condolences from people who trusted him. That choice had a cost. Not because the universe keeps a ledger, it doesn't, but because actions leave records, and records can be read by anyone willing to look. Gran knew that. She wrote her recipes in pencil because she believed in the possibility of getting better. I think she also believed that the people she loved would do the same. I'm trying to.